Salvatori Center was the first of many institutes at CMC. We now have 11, all doing incredible research across different disciplines at the college. I turn it over to George Thomas, who is the director of the Salvatori Center, to introduce our program for the day and our panelists. Professor Thomas, thanks for doing this. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thank you all for coming. I will just give one plug to the Salvatori Center to look out for on social media, some shorter videos with several alum, including several law professors who are currently engaged in constitutional questions, all the way up to current students, just talking a little bit about what they're doing with the Salvatori Center. And those will start being released, I believe, this week, and will roll out through June for the official July, in time for the official July 1st kickoff, I guess, of the 75th year. But let me introduce our panelists and then really get right to it. So I'm delighted to have Bill Kristol here. Bill Kristol is currently the editor-at-large of The Bulwark, but also, and perhaps more importantly for our purposes, he is the chair of the board of advisors of the Salvatori Center. And I also have Jack Pitney here. He is a professor of government at CMC. And again, perhaps more importantly for our purposes, he is a faculty fellow at the Salvatori Center. So we thought we'd really just, speak to a few basic questions that are probably on your minds about the future of American politics, and try to keep the, very conversational and discussion, maybe about 30 minutes, and then really open it up to questions. And I know that there's probably a lot of questions about the Republican Party and Liz Cheney, and we want to get there pretty quickly. But I thought we would actually start with the current administration, since Joe Biden happens to be president, and he is facing an awful lot of issues. So why don't we start with you, Jack? I mean, just how do you think Biden and the Biden administration is doing? Where do you think they're doing well? What do you think are the particular challenges they're facing? What do you think that they could be doing perhaps much better than they are right now?
Well, one, he hasn't incited an insurrection against the government, so that's a plus. And his approval rating has been higher from the beginning than Trump's ever was. Trump never got above 50% in the average of national polls. Also a plus for Biden. He was able to get his rescue plan through Congress. That was quite an accomplishment, but it is a narrowly divided House, a narrowly divided Senate, 50-50. Very difficult for him to continue on legislative items other than stuff that they can cram into a reconciliation bill. That's an inherent problem, not necessarily one of Biden's own making. But for now, he's doing pretty well. The tone of his address to the nation was good. And politically, there are some clouds on the horizon. Economically, there's the federal debt, over 100% of gross domestic product. We're embarked on a great experiment. What happens if we keep running that level of debt over and over and over again? Some people say, hey, no biggie. I hope they're right, but if they're not, Biden's going to have increasing economic problems in the years ahead. Also, the cultural issues that drove some people into the Republican camp, even this past fall. They will continue to be a problem for Biden. So overall, doing pretty well, but who knows what the next couple of years are going to bring.
All right, Bill, will you think about that same question for us? And I guess the, maybe one wrinkle to give it a little bit is think because Biden has promised or, ran on promising some bipartisanship and trying to bring the country together. What do you think the prospects for that are? I mean, so, weave that into your answer in some way, if you could, for us.
I'll try. But first of all, let me say it's great to be with you all. I didn't go to Claremont. I've never taught there formally, but I've spoken there and visited there many, many times, and feel that I've had a long association informally and occasionally formally, and obviously now on the Salvatori board for quite a few years as chairman of the board of advisors. So it's good to be with you. My father was very best friend, really, who died young, unfortunately. Marty Diamond was a professor at Claremont in the 60s, and I remember we actually came out to Claremont, maybe not your typical vacation spot for New Yorkers, in 1968, I think, for a week. Just so my father wanted to see Marty, and was getting away from New York in the summer, I guess. And I remember a pleasant week. I was in high school. I don't really remember. Didn't learn anything much, but had friends who taught at Claremont. Once I got into this racket a little bit and went to grad school. And my first teacher at Harvard was Mark Blitz, who's of course George's predecessor as chairman of Salvatori and a distinguished professor at Claremont. And speaking of social media, as George did, I did a conversation. I do these conversations every couple of weeks that are online with Mark Blitz on his new book, Reason and Politics. I also say you always encounter Claremont people all over the place. I was led a study group, an informal study group at the Institute of Politics at Harvard this past spring on Zoom, obviously. There were 6 of us, I guess, leading groups. So we got together a few times, to take questions from students and socialize among ourselves, again, on Zoom. And one of my colleagues at Harvard was Steve Bullock, who I hadn't realized, I guess, was a Claremont graduate from early mid 80s, something like that. And he told amusing stories, actually, about being, as he put it, the token Democrat at Claremont, which is, I don't think, quite correct. But anyway, it was a good effective talking point for him. So and he has a good education there. If I'm not mistaken, I think maybe his son is now or a daughter, a child, is now there. Yeah. So he was praising Claremont, actually, to this group of Harvard students and others. So it's good to be with you. I think, I agree with Jack. I think Joe Biden's doing well. I mean, it's so hard to even know what metric to use, so unusual to take over in the circumstances he did, both from the president from whom he took over and the circumstances in which he took over after January 6th, and then COVID and the pandemic. I mean, my colleague Jonathan Lass wrote a smart piece about 2 months ago on the Bulwark saying that, Biden's going to have an unusual presidency. The first thing he had to do was COVID. And he seemed at the time, Jonathan wrote that he was doing pretty well. I think that's correct. Now looks like we're not just coming out of the worst of it, but really getting close to kind of getting pretty far beyond it. And I assume we'll all be in school and college next year and, real life and the economy, I do have the sense, is picking up in pretty serious ways. And so, but Jonathan's point was there'll then be kind of a restart for the Biden presidency. His view was that if Biden handled COVID well, he would have real political capital, which he might be able to use for other legislation. I remember at the time I said to him, that can happen. It can also happen that you can handle something very well and you get very little credit. No good deed goes unpunished. I was in the George H.W. Bush White House. We did a pretty good job on the first Gulf War, I got to say. And I think managing the end of the Cold War, I didn't have much to do with either, frankly, but some of those superior to me did a good job. And the voters sort of decided by late 1991, yeah, well, that was very nice. Good job there on the foreign policy stuff, which used to be kind of important for American presidents to do in the Cold War years. But we want change. We want, Bill Clinton, and we went down to 38% of the vote from 54% in 1988. One of the biggest drops, really, of an incumbent president. Kind of amazing if you look back at history and think, was George H.W. Bush really that bad a president? He goes from 54 to 38. It's a good lesson that voters are often quirky and have their own views and have their own priorities, which don't quite correlate with maybe what a historian would say in terms of judgments and so forth. So a long way of saying that I think I may have been a little bit right, though, that I don't think Biden's getting the credit that I kind of feel he should get for the fact that we're coming out of this thing in pretty good shape here with the vaccine distribution, production distribution, some of which was set up before him, obviously, but it wasn't obvious it was going to go that well. Look around at other very advanced countries, it hasn't gone that well. And we're coming out of it in pretty good shape. And the economy looks pretty good, and no disasters or anything in foreign policy yet, or in other ways, no scandals to speak of. So you normally would look at that and think pretty good position, but very polarized country, 50-50 Senate, very close in the House. Not clear voters are changing their minds very much. He's picked up a few percentage points from the election in terms of his approval. So I really don't know. I think he's doing his best. I think he would like to have things pass in a bipartisan way, to get to George's question. Whether you can do it, it's hard in such a polarized, I mean, Jack's written so much about this, in such a polarized and partisan environment. I think it would be interesting psychologically if they get a deal, which they might get, I think, on police reform, where they get bipartisan legislation, in light of George Floyd and the like, and that passes that could happen pretty soon. If they could get a deal on part of the infrastructure package, at least. Maybe a deal on part of immigration. It's there to be had if they can get some people to to go along, and also if some of Biden's supporters are willing to give up on some of their biggest hopes, I think it might change the psychology of the country more than one would think. You know what I mean? More than the actual, deal itself, in a sense, in terms of the legislative impact, the police reform stuff. Honestly, there's 700,000 policemen in the U.S. How many are going to be affected by a federal change? Most of them are almost all state and local. How much would federal legislation really change practices? Maybe not a huge amount, but I think the psychology of a signing ceremony with a few Republican senators and a few Republican House members, at least, standing there with Biden, the psychology also on infrastructure, it could be a big moment. So I do think that the question about bipartisanship is a really important question for the next 2 or 3 months.
Turning more to the Democratic Party in general, what do you think the prospects of the Democrats holding either the House or the Senate are, and what do you think, Jack, the Democrats maybe should be worried about? I mean, 2020 was a really fairly close election in the end, and there seemed to be some real issues for the Democrats in 2022, not just the fact that the structural advantages already kind of lean to the Republican Party. So, I mean, how do you think the party as a whole is doing, and what do you think their real concerns ought to be?
Well, by traditional standards, the Democrats are in serious danger of losing control of the House. They weren't expected to lose seats in 2020, but they did. So it's a very narrow margin. Even if Republicans have a modest seat gain by midterm standards, they take control of the House. Add to that, number one, reapportionment, which is shifting a few seats, not many, but a few, from blue states to red states, and more important, redistricting, which in certain key states, again, is in control of the Republicans. Those things alone could deliver the House to the Republicans. One thing going in the Democrats' favor is, of course, Trump. The Republicans have, in Elise Stefanik's case, sold their soul. And that isn't necessarily a good look to a lot of people in the electorate. So that's one sign of hope. One sign of danger for the Democrats is that the progressive wing of the party probably cost them a bunch of seats in 2020, specifically with the issues of socialism and defunding the police. If I were in my old job as a Republican opposition researcher, every day in the 2020 campaign, I would have said, thank you, God, for defund the police and socialism, which are two phrases that don't play well in much of the United States, and very specifically cost people some seats, probably helped cost Candace Valenzuela her race in Texas, the very intense campaign that was run against her. So they can maintain their issue positions on things like police reform, but watch the language. I mean, you talk about defunding the police, people are going to think you're talking about abolishing the police. And that's not a really good idea politically or substantively.
Bill, do you have anything to add there?
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of the attacks, incidentally, on socialism and defunding the police were unfair, especially in Virginia here, where I live. Abigail Spanberger, a very moderate Democrat who was by no means in favor of either socialism or defunding the police, and never said the words defunding the police. Nonetheless, the Republicans ran pretty effective ads tarring her with what maybe 1 or 2 members had said, or even not even members, but activists on the left. And obviously Joe Biden is not a socialist, and what he's doing even is really big government liberalism, a little bigger than I would like, but it's not socialism. I mean, there's no takeover of the economy. In fact, he's not doing Medicare for all. He's not doing Elizabeth Warren's finance reforms. Much of them actually, he's doing a kind of much more classic Hubert Humphrey, Lyndon Johnson sort of, let's throw a lot of money at programs, which has its problems, but also can do some good. And in any case, I don't think, one reason I'm more relaxed about it than some of my conservative friends is, I think you can save some of that money later on, claw some of it back, so to speak, tax increases, or just cut some of the spending on some of these programs in the out years. And you're not really transforming the economy. It's not written in 1945, and it's not really the New Deal, to be honest. So having said all that, I mean, Jack is right. The Republicans are pretty good at running these types of campaigns. And I mean, the 2020 was a wake-up call for Democrats. Some of them have been awakened. Not sure they all have been, though. And I do think even, believe me, no one is more distressed, I don't think, than I about the Republicans' continued and maybe intensified attachment to Donald Trump. It's an open question, though, how much of a price they'll pay for that. I mean, they paid some price in 2018, no question, when voters, like in my district here in Virginia, wanted to have one branch of government to check Trump when he's busy appointing judges and is president and has Republican control of both houses. Little hard to know how that dynamic works in 2022. I was talking with someone, a very senior Democrat, about that the other day. You know, do you re-elect a Democratic House? I mean, do you get scared by the notion that a Trumpy Republican Party will control one of two, probably not the Senate, but one or two branches of the legislature when Joe Biden's president? They can't really do that much. They could stop Biden from doing a lot, but voters do have a tendency to, Biden's going to get, to want a certain balance in government. So I'd be worried if I were a Democrat. The natural force of losing seats, the natural pattern of losing seats in your first off-year election is one of the best established patterns probably in American electoral history. Now, these rules are made to be broken, and they have been broken in the last couple of decades. And with Trump, you sort of think, oh, these rules don't count anymore. But I think the intelligent Democrats I know are worried. And again, they're sort of worried they won't get credit for the good things. And, the Republicans will attack them on one or two things that one of their followers say. And Republicans may not be scary enough to keep those voters in those swing districts from moving back to from moving naturally in a way back to Republicans, which they left in 2018, and some of them stayed left and stayed departed from the Republicans in 2020.
All right, well, thinking then in particular about the Republicans, let's talk about what's going on with Liz Cheney.
Yeah.
She is facing a vote tomorrow in the House where it looks like she's almost certainly about to be eliminated. Is what the third in charge, third in leadership in the party, and she's being outed because she refuses to go along with what she's calling Trump's big lie. I mean, the insistence that the 2020 election was not stolen, there's no evidence for it, and like, and what's interesting about Cheney, I think, and so I'd like to hear from both of you on this, is she's really set this up as not just a matter of principle, which she has, that certain things have to come first, democracy, free and fair elections, and that we've got to have trust in that. But she's really linked that to a Republican commitment to constitutionalism, the rule of law, and also said that she really thinks this is about the future of the party, and it's not just about short-term gains, but long-term prospects. So, I mean, one of the things that I'd like to hear from both of you on is what do you think her calculations there are? Because I mean, she seems to have now instigated a real fight for the future of the Republican Party, and also seems to think that she has some hope of victory in the long run, if not in the short run, and that victory is really necessary for a successful Republican Party down the road. So, Jack, let's start with you there. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it really depends on how long the long run is. If we're talking about a year or two, maybe not. If we're talking about posterity, yes. And in that sense, in my Congress class, we read Profiles in Courage. And I think what Liz Cheney is doing is very much in that mold. She's almost certainly going to lose her leadership position, could very well lose her seat in a primary next year. And at least for the next couple of years, her prospects are, as a practical matter, aren't that great. It's not as if she's going to be invited to guest host Rachel Maddow. That's the thing about her, because on the one hand, she's alienated a lot of the Republican politicians, but Democratic politicians know A, her name is Cheney, and B, she has a very, very conservative voting record. In that sense, very much like her dad. When I was working for her dad, he was very proud that he had the highest pro-Reagan voting record in the House of Representatives. He's very conservative, and she is too. But as she interprets it, conservatism encompasses the principle of the rule of law, and she's sticking to that. So I think posterity will hold her in high regard. The question is, how long will it be till we get to posterity?
So
I mean, I guess,
on that.
yeah. Well, you guys will write the history, so you'll shape posterity, you know, the political science analysis. I'll say one thing actually about the Democrats, which is relevant to this question, because I do think one forgets, and it's just a natural tendency we all do, that, you know, one looks at the best advice I ever got in Washington when I came in '85 was, you know, politics is not snapshots aren't reliable, right? Things are in motion. And they're often in motion in unpredictable ways. And so you can't just project either the current state of things or, you know, what's happened the last few years or whatever. And Jack and George, you all know this well. I mean, the things reverse, things are surprises, there are events, there's contingencies. So I do think that's very true about what Liz Cheney's involved in. But if you think about the Democrats, I mean, we have an election here in Virginia for governor and for the state legislature. The Democratic primary is in less than a month. If the Democrats nominate Terry McAuliffe, who was the governor and is the moderate Democratic candidate, the establishment Democratic candidate, and he then wins in November. If the New York City Democrats nominate what I would consider to be the two more moderate candidates who have vociferously been anti-defund the police, for example, which is Eric Adams, who was a policeman, the Brooklyn borough president, or Yang, Andrew Yang, who's, I mean, it's hard to know exactly what his ideology is, but he's a business guy, and doesn't look like, he's not the candidate of the left. There are real left-wing candidates, as you'd expect in New York, progressives and so forth. If you've got in Virginia and New York City sort of Democratic, you know, moderates nominated and elected, I think that would help convey the general impression that that party is not as far left as Republicans, certainly, and conservatives like to say. Now, ultimately, Biden's more important than the mayor of New York or the governor of Virginia. I suppose what happens incidentally in the California recall is also not irrelevant. I mean, if Newsom's a popular governor and easily survives recall, and a fair number of moderates vote for him and think he's done an adequate job, that creates a different environment for the 2 or 3 competitive seats, which there are, I think, or at least based on, depending on redistricting, I suppose, but that there were in 2020, for how much you can define the Democrats as the party of the left and of real danger to sort of middle class Americans and so forth. And the same is true in reverse. I mean, the Trump Republicans, I think, can be. I myself would make the argument they maybe should be characterized as a danger, but here in Virginia, it looks like Republicans have nominated a more establishment type Republican. Totally has, of course, refused to criticize Trump, not just refused to criticize, but wrapped himself in Trump's flag, so to speak. Still, he's not going to look exactly like, you know, Marjorie Taylor Greene or one of these people. And so I do think the fluidity in both parts, there are a ton of competitive nominating processes in 2022 for Senate races, open Senate seats, Pennsylvania, Ohio, North Carolina, big high focus states. There'll be races in a lot of other districts. Whenever there's redistricting, there are more open seats usually in the House, because people don't sometimes run for re-election if they get slightly moved around in their district, out of their district. So, you know, what the parties will look like a year from now, I think, is very hard to know. I mean, it really depends on what happens a year and a half from now in these primaries. I mean, on Liz Cheney, though, she embodies the story for me of the last 4 or 5 months, 6 months, which is, I was anti-Trump. I was always pessimistic about the Republicans liberating themselves from Trump, unless he got clobbered badly in November. Even then, I wasn't sure, and he got defeated, but the Republicans picked up House seats. They ended up losing the Senate 50-50, but it wasn't even clear they would lose the Senate. They gain 2 governors, or they held 27 governorships, gained a couple of state legislative chambers and stuff. It didn't feel like a blowout. It wasn't really. And so I was pessimistic about the chances of sort of liberation of the Republican Party from Trump. But a lot of smart people thought that might happen, and it still could. A lot of people thought he goes to Mar-a-Lago, he's, you know, ex-president. They don't usually have much clout. He kind of fades away. Liz Cheney thought that. Liz Cheney's theory of the last 4 years, and I discussed this with her, and I kind of broke is too strong. We drifted apart over this, I would say, is her theory was, you know, swallow hard, don't pick a fight, pick some fights on key things. To her credit, she did fight on a couple of issues, but don't vote to impeach on Ukraine, don't support him nominally, at least for re-election. Liz Cheney supported Trump for re-election. Stay in the House leadership, and then after November 3rd, there's a chance to really change things, to really break from Trump. But as I say, it wasn't my view of things, but it was a reason, it wasn't a crazy view, and a lot of intelligent people held it. And for me, the huge story post November 3rd, and it's now played out in stages, the first being right after November 3rd when Trump challenges everything, and then to January 6th, obviously, but then even after that, the impeachment, the convict, only 10 votes for impeachment, only 7 votes for conviction. Mitch McConnell, after sounding like he's going to chastise Trump, doesn't really pull the trigger. And then McCarthy goes to Mar-a-Lago. Anyway, in stages, it has played out in a way that not only has the party not broken from Trump, despite January 6th, the party, if anything, is, I won't say more captive to Trump, but is certainly unwilling to pick a fight. And, and there are many reasons for that and many dynamics at work. But for me, that's why the Liz Cheney thing is important. As someone who supported Trump, swallowed hard to do so, bent over backwards, you might say, to do so, now is standing up. She just can't believe what happened. I really do believe this for her. I mean, for her, November 3rd through January 6th was such a shock that not so much about Trump, but about her colleagues. It wasn't just that Trump did things. She never had a high opinion of him. She thought he was capable of irresponsible demagoguery. But state officials, thank God, 7 of them held in Georgia and Michigan and elsewhere, but a whole bunch of state officials looked like they were willing to go along with actually just overturning the election. And then 147, I think it was, House of her colleagues in the House vote on January 6th after the takeover of the Capitol and the destruction, the damage done there, to overturn at least one of the slates of electors. And, when everyone's sort of tolerating Trump, and then it turns out they're not just tolerating him for a while, they're tolerating him for a long while. I think that for her was like, oh my God, it's much more serious than I hoped it would be. And I've got to stand here, because otherwise we just have a whole political party going down a path, not so much about the past, but about the future, not committing to respect democratic outcomes, not committing to really be serious about the rule of law and the Constitution and so forth. So I give her credit for what she's doing, but I think it shows how, and that was not, as I say, a lot of people, I don't think most people would have predicted on November 4th after the election, certainly on November 2nd, when it looked like it might be more of a margin, that the Republican Party would be quite where it is today. Even people like me who were pessimistic weren't quite this pessimistic. And so now Liz Cheney is being purged. So it shows in a way it's hard to predict these things, but for now, it's at least the party is going down a very Trumpy road, which I think may hurt them politically, but we can't really prove that. And we won't know until we see what happens over the next year and a half.
Just one last quick question on January 6th, because I mean, from a constitutional perspective, what I continue to be just really puzzled by and frustrated by is we don't seem to have made all that much of January 6th in the end. And it really was an attempt to disrupt the peaceful transfer of power, not a successful one. In that sense, but Democrats don't really want to talk about it all that much either. Republicans clearly they're engaged in what seems to be, with the exception of Cheney and a few others, really in a rewriting of January 6th in some sense. So does this suggest in some sense that we can expect more of this in the future? I mean, in 2024, just thinking about the upcoming election there. I mean, is it, in 2020, it held lots of people under extraordinary pressure, the kind of pressure we've never seen before, stuck with the idea that they had a commitment to the rule of law, elections, and that had to come before any kind of, partisan maneuvering. Should we expect that won't necessarily hold in 2022 and especially in 2024? Jack, I know you have real concerns there.
Yeah, I'm pretty pessimistic on that. Republicans are responding to the sentiments of their primary voters. And if you look at surveys of Republicans, great majority don't think Biden won the election for real. They think that he won on the basis of fraud, even though there's absolutely no basis for believing that, they still believe it. And in terms of January 6th, one datum from the Survey Center on American Life, they asked the question, agree or disagree. The traditional way of American life is disappearing so fast, we have to use force to protect it. And 56% of Republicans said yes, using force. 22% of Democrats said yes. And there are other surveys suggesting that although majority of Republicans didn't approve of what happened on January 6th, a measurable number did. And that's really scary. And as Bill said, you had a lot of the officials held in key states, but there's no guarantee that will continue, particularly if the Trump forces systematically try to purge them. So yeah, I think there's reason to worry.
Yeah, and I agree with that. And I mean, I would say January 6th, maybe there was a little too much focus on the date itself as opposed to November 3rd to January 6th. I mean, that's really the story. Trump's very systematic effort, which people did not stand up to at first. There was that quote in the Washington Post, well, let him talk about this stuff. It's not going to work anyway. And it'll humor him. It'll fade away. And then didn't really fade away. And it got kind of close in some of these states. And then Raffensperger and Georgia and others stood up. And then, but I'll tell one quick story, which has Liz Cheney relevance. It's come out recently that Liz Cheney was much more involved in the letter from the 10 former secretaries of defense, every living secretary of defense from both parties, worrying about the military involvement in things. This was right before January 6th, so there were stories about crowds and so forth. And I think this letter came out January 3rd or 4th. And at the time, it wasn't known how much of a role Liz Cheney and her father both played in apparently helping to organize that letter. That's now come out. But that was, of course, again, that's the whole perspective. But I was in one of these games, simulations in the summer of 2020, people trying to think through what could go wrong between November 3rd and January 6th, actually, because people were alarmed, And so people tried to, I was two of them, I played Trump, or I and a couple other people played the Trump team, let's say the Trump White House. What would we do? And a lot of it was very obvious, which Trump did in fact do, to challenge the results, claim victory on election night, say these late votes were illegitimate, say it was all fraud, attacks local Democratic officials, try to pressure Republican officials. But I remember one of these games, I said, and we were just making things up, obviously. I mean, I said, yeah, moves. It was like a simulation, like a war game. So I said, well, I'm firing the Secretary of Defense, Esper, because frankly, I wouldn't say this publicly, it's for whatever reason, but privately, it's because I want to get more loyalists in there, because you never know with all the things that are happening, you sort of want loyalists at DOD and DHS in case there are riots, and maybe it'd be useful to have some riots, because then you could call in the troops. And I mean, and I remember there were 50 people on this game, senior officials from previous administrations, Republicans and Democrats, more Democrats, non-Trump Republicans, law professors, a lot of intelligent people. And that was met with just like, oh, come on, Bill, that's very amusing. You're never Trump. Like, that just shows you have a good imagination, but come on. I mean, who's ever heard, no one's ever fired the Secretary of Defense after Election Day when you're in the lame duck situation to put in a loyalist. Why would you do that? It's so obviously, the only reason you would do it is you're thinking of doing something illegitimate with the Defense Department. I mean, there's no public policy reason why you need a new SecDef for the last 2 months, presumably after the guy's been there for a year and a half, and you didn't get rid of him earlier. And I remember saying, I don't know. I don't put this beyond him. And now we know. And this is where, Liz Cheney, it turns out, and she has good access to information on this, and they really were worried about what the Defense Department would do. They were worried about DHS. We now know that Barr resisted efforts to get the FBI director fired. But none of that has been internalized, in my view, by the body politic, even by the media in a way, even by the Democratic Party. Why isn't there a commission? It's kind of unbelievable. We had all this happen, and there's still not a congressional commission on January 6th. Now, the Republicans haven't exactly cooperated, so I don't, blame Nancy Pelosi or Schumer on this, or the Biden administration. They don't want to do it in a partisan way for obvious reasons. But in general, there's been a little bit too much complacency. People, when you avoid, a bullet, when you avoid a disaster, often you just kind of forget how close you came to disaster. And I think there's been a little bit of not coming to grips with what happened there in those 2 months.
Okay, thank you both. Let's open this up to questions for about 25 minutes or so. We'll try to do this 2 ways. I'm seeing the chat is actually exploding right now, so I'll try to draw some from the chat as well. But I'll also take questions if you'll just raise your, we used to call it the blue hand, but as far as I can tell, Zoom has already moved on, and it's, your choice of the color. So if you want to just raise your hands, you can. I will, start in order with those questions. Well, but I will pull one from the chat right now, and it's a question from Stephen Pearson, and it's to what extent do you think, and in a little bit you've already spoken to this, Bill and Jack, but maybe a bit more, to what degree will having Trump on the ballot, war politics or turnout? How will it end up influencing? Because it both seems to be a Republican calculation by McCarthy and the like that being affiliated with Trump, it makes it more likely that Republicans will take the House. But there's also this question: does being able to point to the Republican affiliation with Trump mean that you're going to mobilize Democratic turnout? So what do you think of that? And then let's start with hands if you have questions.
Well, as far as turnout goes, that's a big challenge for Democrats. Given that Trump is no longer in office, he isn't the kind of what Democrats perceived of as an urgent threat. That's what motivated turnout in 2018, to some extent in 2020. Not there yet. Obviously, the Republicans are pumped. The Republicans are angry. The Republicans feel aggrieved. That could draw turnout. Now, here in California, it was predictable and predicted that Newsom would cast the recall as Trump versus Newsom, and that's worked out for him. But he also has tremendous tailwind with a recovering economy, a humongous budget surplus, great progress on COVID. That, I think, more than the Trump effect, is going to save Newsom.
Yeah, this is a huge question. Trump, how much as I don't like to, would prefer weren't the case, you could argue Trump did not hurt Republicans down ballot in 2016, and Republicans did surprisingly well in 2020. They outperformed expectations in the House, Senate, really, and at the state and local level. California, they outperformed expectations at the House level. In Orange County, right? So 2018, he was not on the ballot, and in a way, Democrats were able to run against him without him fully mobilizing his voters, perhaps. Maybe that's what 2022 will be more like. But I do think if you're in power, it's tricky. I wouldn't know exactly what honestly, I've talked to a lot of people about this, but I think the Democratic incumbents and the Biden administration have a complicated message to give. They can run on a kind of, look, the country's in pretty good shape, and if it is in pretty good shape, that will help them some. But off-year elections is so much about registering complaints, not about rewarding people so much. That Obama lost, what did he lose, 62 seats or something in 2010? It wasn't, we were coming back out of a pretty horrible financial crisis, not as fast as people wanted, but it is kind of amazing that they punished him quite that much. So I don't know how Biden, can they scare people about the Republicans? Maybe, but if Biden's president, he'll veto anything. So what's really so scary, right? So you may get, the Democrats have a tough hand in 2022.
Hey, Krista Crawford.
Hi, how are you? I'm coming from Chiang Mai, Thailand. I'm class of 91 from CMC, and I'm class of 94 from Harvard Law School, where I was colleagues with some of the Never Trump thought leaders like John Kingston and David French and others at the Bulwark. And we grew up in a generation when the Republican Party was the party of ideas. And many of us have left the Republican Party because obviously there are, the ideas that are being generated by the Trump era are not really ideas. And so my question is, Jen Cabranes and others who are just hardy conservatives, but again, not, we're still intellectual. So my question is, what will it take for Never Trump conservatives, especially the thought leaders, to be able and willing to go back to the Republican Party again? And if we don't, where can we go in the future? Will we continue to vote Democrat? Will we split our tickets? Where else can we go? Is it possible or even desirable for a new party to emerge?
You want me to take that it's much discussed, as you know, on the Bulwark and in every other Never Trump circle. I think my answer at least is, I don't know. I think it's foolish to try to know now. It's, and my personal view is people like me, to the degree we have any influence, should try to help good people get elected in either party, centrists, moderates, whether it's Democrats to the House or Republicans. And there are some good Republicans trying to run. It's tough, where loyalty to Trump becomes such a veto in Republican primaries in Texas. Outside of Dallas-Fort Worth, there was a primary, and the one candidate who was most, not really never Trump, but almost never Trump, didn't do particularly well. Wonderful young man, Marine, 34 years old, very impressive. A couple of other not so Trumpy candidates did okay, but basically the mainstream candidates who were totally accommodating to Trump won. Now, the most Trumpy candidates didn't win, so maybe there's a little hope in that, as in Virginia. But I think people have to make up their own minds. I have no idea whether the Republican Party can be saved. I have no idea whether, from the point of view of people like me, you can end up helping strengthen moderates in the Democratic Party as much as one would like to. But Joe Biden is president, so that's not nothing, you know. And actually, moderates win a lot of these primaries in the Democratic Party. That's sort of the amazing thing. It's for all the media focus on all these progressives, you know. I mean, every time it's an actual primary election, including in Louisiana the other week, you know, the moderate seems to win. So I'm somewhat hopeful about the Democrats. A lot of people talking about independent candidates and third parties. Generally, that hasn't worked too well. I think if ever the parties could break up, it could be, though, now with such unusual circumstances. But I think it's a little, and I respect friends who are very all in on saving the Republican Party. I have friends who basically just said, no, I'm going to be a Biden Republican, a Biden Democrat, if that's the right term, or a Biden Republican, I guess would be the term, like a Reagan Democrat, you know, switch parties. And people who are sort of keeping options open and trying to build coalitions of you know, across the aisle in the center. I think that's one of the big questions of American politics over the next 10 years is how does that play out?
My interest is not necessarily the partisan interest, it's the CMC interest, because when I was there, Bill Buckley called CMC called Claremont the capital of the intellectual capital of the Western world. And it'd be nice to get those thoughts aligned again with, you know, conservative thought and not just liberal thought or even moderate thought. Thanks. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
And you know, as Bill said, a key thing that a lot of us, you know, who have a history, in my case, past tense with the Republican Party, you know, really need to support candidates of both parties who focus on getting stuff done. And I'm using that phrase for a particular reason because I see a hand up from one of those candidates, the distinguished former governor of Montana, whom Bill mentioned, and who not only went to CMC, but did his senior thesis with me.
Well, on that,
And he turned out okay anyway. That's amazing, you know.
Well, and the beauty is, Bill, that Professor Pitney, as a lot of the people on this could actually vouch, that I was one of the few Democrats back at the time. Hey, appreciate you doing this. And look, you know, the word populism, like in a state like Montana, used to be a real positive thing because it meant that power was really with individuals. And it was interesting. I was talking to one of my former colleagues on the Republican side, and I think that he'd be classified as a never Trumper, but he wanted to sort of frame things as saying the problems that we have right now, let's not kid ourselves. Go back to the Weather Underground. Like, this has always been inherent in our nation, the deep division, and it's all politicians get their orders from the people more than anything else. And my response was, I thought that was a little bit of a cop-out from his own perspective and his party. And we've got to kind of recognize that there's always going to be divisions in our society, but it's so much deeper right now because of what we've seen in the last 4 years of Trump and what that's done to the Republican Party. And would appreciate your all's perspective on that.
I didn't realize you were on when I mentioned you earlier, but I hope I didn't say anything to you know, set you back too much or anything. No, it's good to see you, Steve. I sort of agree with your reluctance to let people off the hook too easily. I mean, that is to say, there are a million things going on in the country: social media, socioeconomic sorting, polarization, and partisanship that goes beyond any current politician's, you know, causing. It's been happening for 20, 30, 40 years. So there are plenty of reasons why you could argue politicians today are in a tougher position maybe that a problem-solving politician was 10 or 20 or 30 years ago. And you obviously saw this in your Senate race this year. I mean, that the voters just don't, you're a popular governor and they like you as governor, but you know what, federal race, they're going with their party, not with the individual really. And that's different, as you know, in most states. It was, I think in 1986, when I got to Washington, half the states had split Senate delegations, one Republican and one Democratic senator. In New York had more than Tomato, but there were a million of them, of course. Now I think it's 6, right? There's 47. What is it? 7, 8. I must be an even number. Anyways, like 23. I don't know. I can't remember. 20. There are 22 Republican states, 22 Democratic states. I guess is right, and 6 split states, which is kind of amazing when you think. So that tells you a lot about what's happened in the country. So plenty of excuses available for politicians, and their voters want certain things, and they tend to cater to their voters, and the primary voters matter the most since the states are so predictably Republican or Democrat, and the congressional districts even more so, partly because of gerrymandering. Having said all that, how do you break this without leadership? I mean, people tell me, well, look, if as Jack said, 70% of Republicans believe in some version, perhaps, of the big lie, 60%, depending on what poll you look at. I don't know. There are a million things that should be done to try to make that harder to sell these conspiracy theories. But one thing would be respected elected officials for whom you voted on your side of the aisle, if you're a Republican, standing up and saying that's not true. I mean, it's kind of hard to ask people to to educate themselves out of these conspiracy theories and lies when they're being propagated on major news channels and by major figures like the former president of the United States. If the local Republican governor or senator or member of Congress is unwilling to say, no, I'm sorry, that's not the case. And you can trust me a little bit. You voted for me, I'm your party. I'm a conservative. I'm not one of those left wingers, but and so I think there's been a terrible failure of leadership, especially on the Republican side, really. And Liz Cheney, in a way, what she's doing is admirable, but in a way, most of them should be doing that, not just one of them who's about to get kicked out of the leadership with people. And I really, I keep thinking I'm not going to be shocked anymore, but there are people who have publicly said they're not voting for Liz Cheney. They're going to vote to remove her, who were not pro-Trump Republicans, who worked with Liz Cheney, who hoped that Trump would privately imply that he would lose even. And they're just so terrified of the electorates in their primaries, I guess, that they are publicly saying, oh no, we can't have Liz Cheney there. I mean, it's really depressing, honestly, and at least on the Republican side. Democratic side, I think, is much more complicated, much more interesting, the dynamics between moderates and progressives, and that categories aren't even quite accurate, of course, and there are a lot of cross-cutting cleavages. And I think that's why, for someone like me, thinking about whether one could make some small contribution on the Democratic side right now looks a little more promising than the Republican side.
Yeah, I think sometimes there's a tendency to engage in both sidesism, and there's something to that. Antifa is a real thing, and there were some Democrats who were less than vigorous in their criticism of urban violence, and they deserve criticism, but it's not the same. This was a violent insurrection against the government of the United States, incited by the President of the United States. We have never had anything like that. I suppose the comparisons to the Civil War don't quite work. It's as Bill said, it is so disappointing. People that a few years ago I would have considered voting for president, would have strongly supported politically, and they've been total disappointments. The one stand-up guy is a guy who previously had a reputation for being kind of a chameleon. That's Mitt Romney. I mean, throughout this, he has been the stand-up guy in Congress, and deserves a lot of credit.
Okay, Neil Yeager, you look like you have your, okay, that is an actual hand.
Thank you. I'm just trying to unmute myself. I do have a question, but I have to make a quick comment to Bill Kristol. I had the pleasure of having Marty Diamond for political philosophy, and that was quite an experience. I seem to recall we spent the first week on the first sentence of Plato's Politics. Something like that. Anyway, I'm wondering, the impact of this on our system of government, and really reflecting very badly, raising questions about the security of elections and so forth. The impact overseas. I'm one of the Democrats that happened to come out of CMC as well, but we had the concept of the shining city on a hill. I have the feeling that the luster has gone off, the bloom has gone off the rose, perhaps. That Trump years, in my opinion, have done more to raise questions about our democratic processes than China or Russia could ever have done. And I just wonder if there's, if we're just going to be relegated to another democracy, perhaps, but not the democracy in the worldview at this point.
I mean, I could go first on that if you want. I don't know. I mean, obviously we'll see, but I would be a little more optimistic in this sense. I mean, you and I think, are old enough to remember that in the 60s and 70s, and 50s, which I don't remember, the Soviet Union always attacked the US, and not, of course, without some merit as well. You talk all this stuff about civil rights and equality, human rights and equality and democracy, and look how you treat your own citizens, people who've been there for a long time, former slaves and Black Americans who were denied equal rights. And of course, the whole civil rights movement and the violence in the South, the Soviets regarded that all as a big propaganda opportunity. It ended up being maybe the opposite, you could say, where it turned out that we were able to, with difficulty and not and imperfectly, come to grips with our problems and respond to appeals from Martin Luther King and others, and have Lyndon Johnson, former Texas congressman and senator, stand up before Congress and say it's time for us to act and pass the Civil Rights Bill, the Voting Rights Act, and so forth. So, a lot depends on how we respond, I guess I would say. You could imagine a scenario where we come out of this in pretty good shape, and people look at the US and say, well, they had kind of a few years there where they looked like they weren't able to support their democratic institutions and norms, but it turns out they've rededicated to it. And that could be in both parties, or maybe certainly at least in one party that perhaps dominates for a while, but or not. I mean, I think it's very much an open question. So I don't despair, but I think it's very much connected with our leadership in the world, has been our how we govern ourselves at home. I would also make the opposite point, actually, that I also think, and this is my own personal view about foreign policy, that the fact that it actually helped the civil rights movement at home, that we were making these claims to global leadership in terms of democracy and human rights, and made it harder to say, well, we don't care about any of that stuff. We're just going to govern ourselves however we want. You can govern yourselves however you want. But we weren't saying you can govern yourselves however you want, which allowed people at home to say, well, yeah, we can't really, claim to the world that we're a model unless we fix some of these things. So maybe that part of history could repeat itself. I don't know.
Yeah, on the shining city, American exceptionalism. A few years ago, before he became president, Obama embraced American exceptionalism. Vladimir Putin had an op-ed in the New York Times criticizing Obama, and Putin's most vociferous defender in the United States was Donald Trump. He had basically a media campaign saying, yeah, Putin is raising all these good points. And Trump has explicitly, before he became president, explicitly renounced the whole idea of American exceptionalism. And the second thing about the system is the past few years revealed how much the system depends on virtue, both of the officials and of the people. And this isn't a contradiction of Madison. It's actually what Madison said, that the Republican government, more than any other, depends on virtue. It's a passage of the Federalist that people sometimes overlook. And I hope we're in the process of recovering that virtue. At an advanced age in 2020, for the very first time, I voted for a Democrat for president. I'd never done that before. And for a simple reason. Joe Biden is a good man. Donald Trump is not.
All right, I think we have time for one, maybe two more questions. Just on terms of hands, it'll be easier if you raise your electronic hand, since I can't begin to see all the people actually on the screen. If you do have one there, or I can pull some from the numerous questions in the chat. Brian.
Hi. We talked about the disaffected and former Republicans, but I'm wondering also what the future holds for the connection between the evangelical Republicans who have kind of morphed in their existence through the last several years and the last administration especially, and what the future holds for them as we get to see, basically as the onion starts to peel apart and to take off the layers, and the things that they've been aligned to don't seem to be there as strongly as they think they are. Is there a reckoning coming for the Republican Party with evangelicals, or are evangelicals just going to keep going in the direction that they're headed?
I think that's going to be a big debate in the evangelical community, and there is a debate brewing. I think it's been a little bit under the surface so far. I think Russell Moore and really serious people like that, who are extremely well respected, are going to probably, I gather, do more formally to try to set up organizations to, from their point of view, kind of save the evangelical community from the politicization and the bad leadership they've had, as they see it, over the last few years. And it's going to be, I think, one of the important factors in American politics. And it's not something that, I mean, those of us outside can have some limited effect, I suppose, but honestly, that's something they're going to have to wrestle with. And look, there are reasons why they wanted to overlook aspects of Trump. There were important policies, especially to many of their members, that really seemed decisive, and where the Democrats are not even close to being, don't even look open-minded, I guess, from their point of view. I think some of that was exaggerated, the religious liberty issues and so forth. But, you know, there were times when the Democrats, as Jack sort of said in a different context earlier, gave decent, earnest voters in that world a real sense of, gee, they're just not interested in what we have to say, or the way we think almost, or the way we live. So I think how that plays out is another real variable over the next several years.
Yeah, and some of it is also a gap between younger and older evangelicals. I think the older evangelicals see it as a team jersey. The younger evangelicals probably more serious about the theology and have a very different view of Trump. At least that's the impression I get from people who belong to InterVarsity and from certain polling data.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for turning out. I'd really like to thank Bill Kristol and Jack Pitney for their insight. And of course, look out for some not only future Salvatori events along these lines. I think, COVID's had many downsides. I think one of the upsides is that we will be doing more of these sort of virtual events where we can, not just have a lot of alums, but parents and get people to meet more easily. Of course, it'll be, great to have the AF actually back in the fall. But so look out for some Salvatori events along those lines, and look out for some of the social media posts we'll be having. They're much briefer, but we have people like Elizabeth Wydra at the Constitutional Accountability Center, and Alon Werman, a young, bright legal scholar. We talked to them for about 10 minutes or so, and get some insight on what they're working on and what their affiliations were with Salvatori and how CMC influenced them in their careers. But again, thank you all so much for turning out, and happy beginning of the 75th. And also, I suppose on this one thing, since we're plugging alums, just one quick plug to Henry Olsen, who's actually been one of the more thoughtful, both, kind of flirts with Trump because he thinks that this is the future of the Republican Party, but is critical when he needs to be. And Henry Olsen had a great piece in the Washington Post, I think just today, maybe it was yesterday, on that Liz Cheney will lose her leadership position formally, but she can actually really take it up. And he suggested she go to the floor and simply force her colleagues to confront the evidence, and each day simply take the floor and start refuting the fraudulent claims about electoral fraud in the 2020 election. And he was suggesting that as a way to actually begin to exercise real leadership to move the Republican Party in the direction it needs to go. So you might take a look at that. I don't know. I can't say that Henry had an affiliation with the Salvatori Center in his days, but he might have, but he is an alum. So I will plug that. But again, thanks to Bill and Jack for an insightful discussion. And again, thank you all for turning out.